For those of you who may be new to the LCC, we're a partnership among public and private groups working to meet large-scale conservation challenges across the 5-state Great Basin region. We have supported a variety of conservation projects on high-priority topics. This series highlights a few of these projects, plus more. We hope that these webinars can provide a platform for discussion about the research and its application to the Great Basin. We're going to keep today's presentations relatively short, about 30 minutes, and then reserve the second half of the hour for Q&A with the presenters. Since there are a lot of folks on the webinar, we ask that you type in your questions as they arise. We'll read out your questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar will also be recorded and available on our website. For the logistics on how to ask your questions, if you look on your screen, you'll notice there should be a small collapse control panel in the upper right corner. If you click on the small arrow button, you can expand the control panel. In this expanded control panel, you can send in a question by simply typing it into the chat area and then pressing send. The question will go to our moderator, and at the end of the webinar, the questions will be grouped and read out as we can get to them. So right now, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Courtney Conway and Paul Makala. Courtney Conway is the leader of the USGS Idaho Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and he's also a professor in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Sciences at the University of Idaho. Courtney received his PhD from the University of Montana, his MS from the University of Wyoming, and a Bachelor of Science from Colorado State University. He was the assistant leader of the Arizona Cooperative Unit for 11 years before moving to Idaho in 2011. Courtney's research focuses on the effects of land use and management actions on behavior and demography of wildlife populations. He is the PI for the Grouse and Grazing Project, a collaborative research project designed to document the relationship between cattle grazing and demographic traits of greater sage grouse. Paul Makala is a fish and wildlife biologist with the U.S. Bureau of Land Management at the Idaho State Office in the Branch of Resources and Science in Boise, where he serves as the program lead for wildlife management. He has been actively involved for the majority of his career with sagebrush and sage grouse conservation planning, its implementation and policy development at the field, state, and national levels. And Paul is also a strong advocate for research that addresses land management challenges. Paul has a Master of Science in Wildlife Biology from the University of Montana and a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from the University of Michigan. Today's webinar is titled Effects of Grazing on Sage Grouse and Other Shrub Steppe Birds, a collaborative project to inform management of sage steppe rangelands. And with that, we'll hand it over to Courtney.
Great, thanks, John. And thanks everyone on the line for joining us for this presentation. As many of you know, sage grouse have been declining dramatically over the past 50 years throughout their range in Western North America. And because of these declines, sage grouse have been petitioned for ESA listing 9 different times. And despite the fact that the greater sage grouse has yet to be, is not currently listed, we're not out of the woods yet. These declines do not appear to be dissipating, as the graph shows, and so we need to ensure that actions on landscape do not further cause declines in sage grouse populations. There are numerous factors that have been implicated for these declines in sage grouse populations, and the primary ones have been an increase in fire effects on sagebrush systems, as well as oil and gas development. And so cattle grazing has not been considered the most important cause of these declines, but livestock grazing is ubiquitous throughout the greater sage grouse range, and so there's been quite a bit of debate on the effects of livestock grazing on greater sage grouse, and it has been the topic of lots of recent litigation. And yet there's surprisingly little research on this topic. We know very little about the effects of livestock grazing on sage grouse. And as a result of this void, there's been the litigation that occurred on this topic has been primarily decided based on expert opinion. And there are no shortages of opinions on the relationship between livestock grazing and sage grouse. So this is just an example of a recent quote from a document from the Sierra Club that says that the greater sage grouse declines are due to overgrazing and oil and gas development. So that statement it's hard to find a citation that you could use to support that statement, that these declines from 16 million to 200,000 are due to overgrazing. And so, and indeed, there was a review almost 20 years ago by Jeff Beck who summarized what we know and what we don't know about the relationship between sage grouse and grazing. And at the end of that review, Jeff concluded that replicated field experiments are needed to determine the effects of grazing treatments on sage grouse nesting success and brood survival. And so the study that we implemented 4 years ago that I'm going to talk about today is really an attempt to fill this void, because even though that review paper was published 17 years ago, when we started this study 4 years ago, there was still no field experiments that had been implemented to look at the effects of livestock grazing on sage grouse demographic traits. So we initiated a study 4 years ago that was designed as a large-scale field experiment to assess the effects of spring cattle grazing on 11 sage grouse demographic traits. Also, its effects on a suite of sage grouse habitat features that have been shown to influence sage grouse demography, on insect abundance, because we know that arthropods are an important food source for sage grouse chicks, and on the abundance of all bird species in the sagebrush community that coexist with sage grouse. And from the outset, we particularly wanted to focus on spring grazing because that's the most controversial, this grazing during the spring when sage grouse are actively nesting. And we focus specifically on cattle grazing because that is more common throughout the West than other types of livestock grazing. So we implemented a before-after control impact design, a BACI design, to assess the effects of grazing on sage grouse. And so at each one of our study sites, we've identified 4 BLM grazing pastures. All of our study sites are on BLM lands. And at each one of our study sites, we identify 4 grazing pastures. And for 2 years, we collar sage grouse and collect information on demographic traits and vegetative traits in those pastures. And then after those first 2 years, is when we manipulate the grazing regime and implement our experimental grazing treatments. So in one of those pastures, we switch it to a spring only grazing in odd years only. So it's grazed in the spring. For instance, in 2017, it's rested in 2018, grazed again in the spring only in 2019, and then rested again, and so on. The second pasture is kind of a mirror image of that. It's also a spring-only grazing treatment, but it's grazed in even years only rather than odd years. The third treatment is our no grazing treatment, a third pasture, so it has no livestock grazing whatsoever for at least 4 consecutive years after we implement the treatments. And then our fourth treatment is a spring and fall grazing treatment, so that every other year it's alternated between spring grazing, then fall grazing, then spring grazing, then fall grazing. And so this last treatment is intended to mimic what's typically done on BLM allotments in southern Idaho. And so this is the experimental design that we've been implementing over the past 4 years. And all these, what I have pictured here is replicated currently at 5 different study sites. And so that means that we are currently working in 19 different experimental pastures at those 5 study sites, and each one of these pastures is quite large. They vary in size from 5 to 38 square kilometers in size, each pasture. And again, this is what's pictured here is replicated at 5 study sites. Our goal from the outset was to implement this at 9 study sites to get replication of each one of these treatments. So our 5 study sites, as I mentioned, are in southern Idaho, Browns Bend, Sheep Creek, Pacimaroy Valley, Big Butte, and Jim Sage. So they span a pretty large area throughout sagebrush country in southern Idaho. Here's a diagram of one of our study sites, our Browns Bend study site. And each one of these colors is a pasture that we've randomly assigned to our 4 different experimental treatments. And overlaid on this are the sage grouse nests that we've located of collared sage grouse over the past 4 years. Each one of the colors represents a different year of the study, the 4 years of the study. And so as you can see, we find nests in each one of these experimental treatments that we've assigned randomly to these grazing pastures. But I also want to point out that, you know, sage grouse, our collared sage grouse, don't always nest where we want them to. And so we do find and monitor nests that occur outside of our 4 grazing treatments in adjacent pastures. And so we monitor those nests as well, and we collect vegetation data on those nests. And so for today's talk, I'm going to be presenting some preliminary results that incorporate all of the nests, both the ones that we find in our experimental pastures and also these nests that occur in pastures adjacent that are grazed, but they're not going to be manipulated. So the work that we do is takes a lot of effort to collect this information. It's a fairly large field effort. We have this past summer we had 25 seasonal field technicians working at these 5 different study sites, and we collared approximately 200 hens per year, and that has allowed us to locate and monitor approximately 120 sage grouse nests per year. So it's a large amount of field work to collect this data. But in addition, we're doing some very intensive vegetation sampling on all of these pastures. So again, this is that example study site, our Browns Bend study site with those 4 pastures, and the yellow dots are random points where we do intensive vegetation measurements in those 4 pastures. And so at each one of those yellow points is a 30 meter by 30 meter sampling plot where we collect a whole suite of intensive vegetation measurements. We also collect these same measurements at all of our nest sites. And so I'll be presenting some preliminary data from these intensive vegetation plots that occur at random points in our pastures. So just a little bit more detail on what we do at these intensive sampling plots, these 30 meter by 30 meter plots. So we measure individual grasses. We measure over approximately 80 individual grasses at each one of those plots. So this past year, we did that at 482 plots across our 5 study sites. And so for each one of those 80 grasses at each one of those plots, we're measuring the height of these grasses, the phenology, the percent of the biomass that's been removed by herbivores, and a suite of other characteristics of each individual grass. And so just this past year, that translates into we've taken these measurements on over 100,000 grasses per year. Okay, so I'm going to present some preliminary results. I want to stress that these are still preliminary. This study was designed as a 10-year study, and we just finished our 4th year of data collection. So we're not even halfway through, but I wanted to just give you some tantalizing preliminary results to demonstrate the amount of data that we're collecting and the inferences we'll be able to make. So the first bit of preliminary results I'm going to present are based on logistic exposure analysis of daily nest survival in RMARC, where we compared 29 candidate models to look at what factors, what variables most influence daily nest survival of sage grouse. And so the top model was one that included just two variables, year and grass height, droop height of grasses. And so I just presented the two most extreme years. So nest survival varied among our 4 years. With 2014, it was the highest of the 4 years, and 2017 was the lowest. I didn't put the other 2 years in here because they're in between these two curves. But the interesting point I really want to show here is this relationship between grass height and sage grouse nest survival. So as you can see, it's this kind of monotonic increase in the probability that a nest survives with increasing grass height. And so this obviously has bearing on the sage grouse habitat management guidelines, and it's really the type of result that's been shown in other sage grouse studies that have looked at the effects of grass height on nest survival, and is one of the reasons that it's been suggested that grazing has an adverse effect on sage grouse, because nest survival increases with grass height. So looking at these data can be looked at, the same kind of relationship can be looked at in a different way. So for this next analysis, I used an analysis of variance with grass height as the response variable and year, study site, and plot type as 3 explanatory variables in the analysis of variance. And so by plot type, I mean is divided into 3 different types of plots, 3 different levels of that plot type variable. Those are random plots, those yellow dots that I showed you in the map earlier, and then plots that were measured at failed sage grouse nests, and plots that were measured at successful sage grouse nests. So these 3 levels are what constitute this plot type variable. And so that plot type was significant in that analysis of variance, and the results are plotted here. So this is the average grass height at random plots, at plots at failed nests, and then over here at plots at successful nests. And as you can see, the average grass height at successful nests was significantly higher than the grass height at random and failed nests. And so again, this is the kinds of results that are available from past studies, and it's the kind of results that have really informed the current sage grouse habitat management guidelines, that grass height tends to be taller at successful sage grouse nests. One of the things of those hundreds of thousands of grasses we're measuring, we're also recording the species of grass, so we can break these kinds of relationships down by individual species of grass. And so doing that, one of the common bunch grasses, native bunch grasses in our study sites is bottlebrush squirreltail. And so this relationship mirrors what I just showed you for when we pool all grasses together. Successful nests have taller grass height for bottlebrush squirreltail than random or failed nests. But other grasses, their relationship is much less clear. So for this particular species, sandbird bluegrass, there doesn't seem to be a difference between failed and successful nests, and they're slightly taller than random plots, but not significantly so. And so sandbird bluegrass is actually the most common grass species at all 5 of our study sites, but the patterns are less clear. And so I bring this up because there's been some studies that have shown that have been unable to find a difference in grass height between failed and successful nests, and other past studies that have found an effect. And so if our own data here with large sample sizes suggest that may be explained by the type of grass plant present in those previous studies. We do the same kinds of analysis with forb height on these intensive vegetation plots. We're measuring grass height, but we're also measuring forb height and other parameters. And so again, the same relationship here. Successful sage-grouse nests have taller forbs than random plots or failed nests. And again, a similar analysis with percent shrub cover. Successful nests have greater shrub cover than random plots, and only slightly higher shrub cover than failed nests. And again, these kinds of analyses are the analyses that have many of which have been reported in previous studies, and are the types of analyses that have driven the sage-grouse habitat management guidelines. So in a nutshell, what I've just shown you is that successful sage-grouse nests have taller grass height, taller forb height, and greater shrub cover than random plots and failed nests. I also want to point out that the sage-grouse habitat guidelines suggest that 15 to 25% shrub cover is what's optimal for sage-grouse. But as you can see, when you compare successful nests to random plots on our 19 different pastures across 5 study sites, sage-grouse are nesting in the upper extreme of shrub cover compared to what's randomly available in those pastures. In other words, they are seeking out the most densest portions of these allotments as far as shrub cover to place their nests. Okay, now I'm going to kind of throw you a curveball and talk about a different analysis that kind of suggests something different. And so the next approach I took is a logistic regression analysis at the pasture scale. So in this analysis, the nest fate of sage-grouse nests, whether a nest was successful or not, was the response variable, and year, study site, and grazing were predictor variables. But in this case, this grazing prediction variable was whether or not the pasture that the nest was in was spring grazed, was grazed during the spring, was grazed during the summer or fall, or was not grazed at all. So that's what this grazing variable is for this analysis, whether the pasture that a nest was in and what grazing regime occurred there in that year. And so study site was significant in that logistic regression, and so was the grazing regime. So the way in which a pasture was grazed was a significant predictor of whether nests in that pasture were successful. But surprisingly, perhaps, it's not in the direction that was implied by those plot level analyses. So nesting success is here on the y-axis, and these are those 3 types of pastures, the pastures that were not grazed in that calendar year, so they were rested, pastures that were grazed during the summer or fall, and then pastures that were grazed during the spring. And so nests in these grazed pastures, or nests in the non-grazed pastures, actually had lower nesting success than nests in these pastures with the different kinds of livestock grazing, cattle grazing. So these are correlative analyses. They're preliminary, but they're based on a fairly large sample size, as you can see. This constitutes 17 different grazing pastures. Again, these are not just our experimental pastures. There's our pastures surrounding those, and 86 sage-grouse nests. This is based on 23 different pastures of 90 sage-grouse nests, 33 pastures, and 140 sage-grouse nests. So this kind of preliminary result is kind of contrary or opposite of what I just presented earlier when I looked at the plot level, the 30 meter by 30 meter plots showing that grass height was positively related to nest success. Okay, I'm gonna change gears now and just give you the last little set of results because the title of my talk was not just about sage-grouse. It was about the effects of these grazing treatments on other sagebrush birds. And so in addition to all the work we're doing on sage-grouse, we've also been doing standard avian point count surveys within all of our pastures for the past 2 years. And so we have 538 530 survey points, point count survey points, where we've been doing point counts. And we've been surveying those for 2 years, and we do we try to do 4 visits per year. And so that has amounted in almost 2,000, almost 1,800 point count surveys that we've done, and over 16,000 detections of birds on those point count surveys. So again, this is a large data set. And so again, this last set of analyses data I'm gonna present to you are based on Poisson GLM, general linear models, with the number of birds as the response variable for a particular species, and then year, site, and grazing as factors in that, or as explanatory variables in that general linear model. So I did a separate Poisson general linear model for each species of passerine that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And again, these were the 3 explanatory variables in those GLMs. And once again, this grazing variable here is the grazing regime within the pasture where the point count was located. So it was either not grazed, spring grazed, or summer fall grazed. So I'm going to show you results for individual species that were the most common on our study sites. So horned lark, so there's 4 species across our 5 study sites where we have recorded over 900 detections on our surveys in the past 2 years. Horned larks is one of those common species. And as you can see, horned larks are less common in the pastures that have not been grazed. They're more common in grazed pastures than in non-grazed pastures. Vesper sparrows are the opposite. They're more common in the non-grazed pastures than they are in the pastures with the summer or fall or spring grazing. And then the other 2 species that are really common are the relationships are a little less clear. Brewer sparrows and western meadowlarks seem to be more common in the summer and fall grazing pastures, and their abundance in the no grazing pastures and the spring grazing pastures were very similar for these 2 species. Okay, and then the only other 2 species I'm going to mention are those that were a little less common, but still a large sample size to examine these relationships. So these 2 species, we've logged over 500 detections. So sage thrashers, like Vesper sparrows, are more common in the non-grazed pastures compared to the 2 types of grazed pastures. And sagebrush sparrows, the relationship is again less clear. They're less abundant in the summer and fall grazed pastures, but we weren't able to detect any difference between the no grazed and the spring grazed pastures. Okay, so from these point count surveys, basically in a nutshell, there are some species that appear to be benefit from a complete removal of livestock grazing. Certainly Vesper sparrow and sage thrasher, the data suggest that they're more abundant in the pastures that don't have livestock grazing. Other species like horned larks are more abundant in the grazed pastures. The abundance is lower in the ungrazed pastures. And then there's other species where the relationship is more nuanced, and they appear to be less or more common in those summer and fall grazed pastures. And all of these results are for these passerine birds are results that have been that corroborate past studies. So we know from other studies that horned larks do seem to be positively affected by grazing. They have been shown to be more abundant in areas that have been grazed, and these 2 species have been shown to be less abundant in pastures that have been grazed. Okay, well, that's all the data preliminary data I want to present, and so I just really want to spend the last couple minutes talking about the uniqueness of the study. We truly believe that this is a very unique, once in a lifetime study that will be hard to replicate and hard to do again, and that's because we are implementing really large-scale grazing experiments. And it was designed from the outset as a 10-year study, and it's a highly collaborative project. We have a lot of different partners, BLM, Idaho Fish and Game, the Great Basin LCC is providing some of the funding for this study for this past year and the coming year. The Idaho Governor's Office has provided us with a small amount of funding. The Public Lands Council has provided, has funded a proposal for each of the past 3 years, and so it's funded by a diverse number of entities. But also from the outset, we put together a 10-member, what we call our planning team. So we knew that this topic was going to be, that this study was going to be going to have some pitfalls and some hurdles and some challenges to pull off successfully. And so we put together a 10-member planning team from the very outset. We put it together over a year before we even started and before we even had any funding or had a study plan in place. And so that planning team helped write the study plan, helped decide how we were going to address this question, helped us attain our initial funding for this project, and has been really valuable. And of course, it's a very collaborative project because we need local ranchers to buy in to working with us, because it's their cows that we're asking them to move around and to lay off complete pastures and not graze it for 4 years. So those aren't easy things to ask a group of ranchers. And so we spend a lot of face time talking to ranchers. We get turned down sometimes, but we've had some success in getting ranchers to say, okay, we're willing to try this and to work with us. So it's really, I think, unique in a lot of different ways for a typical kind of wildlife study, because we're doing large-scale landscape experiments with local ranchers' cows and doing it on BLM lands. I mentioned that our 10-member planning team. Here are the entities, the people on that planning team. I particularly want to point out that from the outset, we've had 2 ranchers on our planning team. They have been absolutely instrumental in helping this project get to where we are today. They believe that they truly believe, rightfully so, that we are objective and that we want to know the answer regardless of which way it points. And so they appreciate that, and they really just want to feel like science, good science, objective science, is driving grazing policy on public lands and not people's opinions. And both of these individuals are 3rd, 4th, 5th generation ranching families in Idaho, and they have been great to work with. They've stayed engaged. They attend our monthly conference calls regularly, and they have for over 4 years. So I can't say enough about how useful they have been in the process without trying to influence us in any way. We feel absolutely no pressure to find a particular result from them. And the last thing I want to say is that, what I presented today are preliminary results. They are correlative results. So I did not present any of our experimental results. The experiment is very much still in its infancy. Over the coming years, the next year or 2 or 3, we'll start to be able to have some inferences from those experiments. I also want to give several caveats and the data that I presented. I presented only data on nesting success, so that's only one of 11 demographic parameters, and so the relationships not only differ, but likely differ among different demographic parameters. So keep that in mind. And again, that this is a study in progress, and what I presented is just really starting to scratch the surface today. And then the last, I guess, caveat is that the ranchers that we work with are probably some of the more conscientious ranchers. The ones that that really want to know the truth about the relationship between cattle grazing and sage grouse. So it's certainly not a random sample of ranchers that we're working with, and so we just have to kind of keep that in mind. And lastly, I just want to thank the large number of collaborators and funding sources that we're working with productively to make this happen. I forgot to mention WAFWA. We have funding from the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, as well as the other entities that I mentioned, and the Idaho Cattle Association as well. So with that, I want to turn it over to Paul Makala. Paul is our point of contact with the BLM. He's on our planning team. He's been very engaged and very helpful on our study throughout. We work with BLM field offices throughout the state. So at each one of our study sites, we're working with a different field office in BLM. And so we work really closely with the BLM staff at each one of those field offices on the logistics of the grazing experiments. But Paul is the statewide lead. He sits on our planning team and has been a great asset. So I'll turn it over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. From Idaho BLM's perspective, I just wanted to say that we're extremely excited to be an active and ongoing partner in this project. I just wanted to build a bit on what Courtney has said earlier. It's really important to note that BLM administers over 50% of the sage grouse habitat in Idaho, as well as the western United States, and by extension, that of sagebrush-associated passerine birds and other wildlife. And so we clearly, as an agency, have a strong interest in the outcome of this study and being an active and ongoing partner. I want to be clear, though, that BLM, along with our other partners, fully recognize that, as Courtney mentioned, that in the Great Basin, fire and invasives are considered to be the primary threats to sagebrush steppe and associated species. So we continue to place a great deal of emphasis on managing or mitigating those factors to the extent that we are able. Having said that, though, and as Courtney mentioned, livestock grazing is still the most widespread land use in sage grouse habitat and sagebrush communities, and so it clearly has the potential to influence plant communities or wildlife at those local scales at which we manage, and that's kind of the crux of the issue. And that's the reality of the working landscapes that BLM and others manage in the West, and one of the reasons this study came to fruition in the first place. So in general, and as Courtney kind of touched on, the limited available literature suggests that the effects of grazing on sage grouse can range from the negative to the neutral or positive, depending on site scale factors and local management practices. But there's also developed a sort of a general understanding or assumption, as noted in the 2015 not warranted finding, that well-managed grazing can be compatible with sage grouse persistence. As Courtney mentioned, though, empirical evidence based on rigorous control studies has been lacking, and not without good reason. And I'd submit that studies evaluating the effects of any management prescription or practice on a wide-ranging landscape species like sage grouse are by necessity, extremely complex logistically and technically, as you've probably discerned from Courtney's presentation just now. Just to touch on a couple of factors, aside from a solid study design and willing cooperators and permittees and suitable large enough landscapes and adequate bird populations to work with, these sort of studies also entail a significant long-term commitment of time, staff, and in particular funding. It should be clear by now that without a reliable flow of funding across multiple years, it's really difficult to keep an effort like this project solvent. And then you throw in periodic wildfires and other stochastic events, and it's easy to understand why folks may have been reluctant to undertake this sort of study in the past. In terms of management implications of this study for BLM, as Courtney pointed out, the study really is still in its infancy, and we've only completed the fourth of 10 or more field seasons with only 2 years of controlled experiments under our belt to date. So it would be, really premature of me at this time to speculate in any detail on what kind of where we're headed with this in terms of applications. Without getting further down the line relative to those impacts to other demographic factors and covariates. That said, though, my hope at least is that the results will ultimately, over the next several years, provide some defensible insight into development of a suite of management tools or prescriptions or maybe more refined guidelines that we can use to adaptively manage sagebrush landscapes to benefit wildlife and land health and cooperative relationships. So, but at this time, the specific details of those tools or guidelines or how those might look remain to be seen. And, there's a tremendous amount of work to do, as Courtney pointed out. So at this point, we're going to have to be patient for a while as things continue to unfold. With that, I think I'll turn it over to the coordinator, and we'll take some question and answer.
Great. Thank you both for this presentation. So at this point, I'm going to be facilitating our Q&A session. And so we've already had quite a few questions that have been typed in. And if others on the line have additional questions, please go ahead and type those in now into the question box that John showed you how to use at the beginning of the presentation. And we were going to try and get through as many of these questions as we can in the next 15 or 20 minutes. But if we don't get to your question, we will send these all to the presenters so that they can follow up with you offline. But to start off here, the first question here is wondering, how are you addressing the concept of overgrazing? Is that what the spring and fall pastures are supposed to represent? Or are you just addressing grazing in general?
Well, our experiments the grazing experiments that we're doing have to fall within levels that are already in the grazing permit of the permittees. So those grazing permits are developed and implemented and signed on a 10-year basis, is my understanding. I think that's what's typical. Paul can correct me if I'm wrong, and so it became clear from our planning team that we can't do this project and ask BLM and the permittees to completely redo their 10-year grazing permits at each site as a part of the study. So that's the backdrop. We have to stay, any experiments that we put, that we compare, we had to keep them within the grazing permit. And so initially, the planning team wanted to have a 60% utilization treatment, a moderate to heavy grazing treatment, if you will. And we had to pull back on that because of the issue that I just brought up, because it's basically nowhere in Idaho do BLM offices allow a 60% grazing on native bunch grasses. They might allow something close to that on a crusted wheatgrass seeding, but so because of that, our grazing treatments are intended to stay below 40% utilization. And so whether you call that overgrazing is, I guess, an opinion or a judgment call. We did want to have a higher grazing treatment than that, but we can't. So I think that answers your question. I will say that we've really tried to work with the permittees and the BLM regional offices or district offices to try to get the permittees to graze as close to that 40% maximum as they can, just so that we do have so that the study can have some inferences on what the effects are of grazing right up to what a rancher is allowed to graze. But yeah, we are not going to be able to say what happens if you graze a pasture at 60, 70, 80%. In other words, there are people that overgraze their permit. They graze more than they're supposed to, and our study won't be able to address that issue.
Thank you. We're receiving a lot of questions here, kind of wondering about the presence of invasive weeds in your plots. Were there invasives present, and how did you account for this? And did that have an impact on any of the results?
Yeah, thanks. We chose these 5 sites specifically. We had a list of criteria for selecting study sites, and one of those criterion were that there's a very limited amount of invasive grasses. So we were specifically trying to find sites that were dominated by native bunch grasses. And so by and large, our study sites have comparatively little invasive grasses. There is a fair, some cheatgrass at all of our study sites. We're documenting that. In some of the, I didn't go into as much detail as I could have on the analyses, but the models that I presented some of the candidate models did include that cheatgrass variable and interactions between cheatgrass and grass cover and so on. So we are taking that into account as the amount of cheatgrass that's present, but by and large, our studies are pretty dominated by native grasses.
Great, thank you. And a question here about the results that you presented. So did sage grouse nest success differ between spring grazing in the current year versus spring grazing last year?
Yeah, good question. I have looked at that, and no, it didn't. And so I've looked at in the analyses that I presented again. One of the I included models that included a lag effect, so how it was grazed the previous year, and that 1 year lag variable did not come up in the top set of models, but the current year grazing regime did. I think there's more nuances there. We're going to be able to, as we gain more and more data from this each year, the sample sizes are going to allow us to really look at a lot of interactions between variables. And so I would expect that how a pasture was grazed in 1 or 2 years prior to the current year probably has an interactive effect with the current year's grazing. And so the analyses I've been able to do so far, again, they're preliminary, did not show that those lag effects from previous years were important. But when you start getting a lot of two-way interactions, it demands more data to do justice of looking at those interactions. And so I suspect that those types of effects will start to be important, I'm guessing, although I don't know, as we get more and more data. Yep.
Great, and this is just a kind of clarifying question. Can you explain exactly what determines nest success?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but let me try. So nest success is just simply whether the eggs hatch, and so we go to great extremes not to disturb a nesting hen. We have a very detailed protocol to monitor the nests from a distance, and they're collared. All the nests we're monitoring have a collared hen, and so we can tell from a distance whether the hen is no longer at the nest location by her telemetry signal. And when that happens, we then walk in to the nest bowl and determine whether the eggs hatched based on the eggshell remains and the evidence at the nest bowl. And so a success just means hatched.
Great, thanks. I think that gets at the question there. So this one is a little bit of a longer question, but the member of the audience is referring to a Smith et al. Research that's currently in the process of being published that kind of questions a temporal bias that's associated with the majority of sage grouse studies, and that's a temporal issue with grass height and relationship to nest survival. And
Yep.
So the audience member is asking if you have methods employed that address this potential issue within your study.
Yes, thanks. Good question. Yes, we do. In fact, a grad student of mine and I published a paper on that very topic 5 years ago, before the Smith paper, that showed that very same issue across all bird species, that bias exists. And so we've taken into account from the very outset of the study design. So we measure vegetation at nest sites at the same time whether they failed or succeeded. So we measure grass height and we measure all of our habitat variables, including grass height, within a week of the estimated hatch date. So for failed nests, we don't measure those plots earlier than successful nests, which is what causes the bias that the speaker's talking about. We measure them exactly at the same time, and we measure the random plots at the same time too. So we don't have that temporal bias.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we had several questions that came in related to that. So one other methodology question here, what was the time on and off for your summer and fall grazing, and was it consistent across the sites?
Yes, we've used a consistent time frame to identify spring and fall grazing. We basically use the calendar year, seasonal definition. So spring grazing is 15 to March to 15 June, and fall grazing is September through December. So and that really brings up a good question. Well, let me just say that all of our study sites, the other criterion is that they have Wyoming big sage in at least as a portion of the overstory. So we're not working in high elevation sagebrush systems. We're working in lower, drier Wyoming big sage systems. So the phenology differs a little bit because we do have some subtle differences in elevation among the 5 study sites, but by and large it's pretty close, and we're measuring phenology of grass, flower, and seed production. So I haven't incorporated that in the analyses that we've done so far, but I will be able to. But the other issue really important issue that it brings up is that sage grouse don't really necessarily respond in a categorical way to spring grazing versus summer grazing versus fall grazing, right? So I think a better way to analyze these data is something similar to maybe time since last grazing. And so anyway, it's a very rich issue that we think a lot about, and categorizing grazing as just this rigid season as spring versus summer versus fall is probably not the best way to look at it. And so, yeah, it's a great question. It's something we're gonna look at it in a variety of different ways. And the number of days or the number of months since a pasture was last grazed prior to the current grazing nesting season is one way that I intend to examine it. So it would be more of a continuous variable rather than a categorical variable. That's just one of many ways I've been thinking about that we can further explore this relationship.
Great. And we're getting quite a few questions just wanting some clarification on these pasture sites and some of their characteristics. I'm going to kind of group these together for you. First, are these areas in big sagebrush, or is it kind of a mix of low sagebrush and big sagebrush? So what's that composition? And then also kind of along the same line, are there differences in, riparian and mesic habitat availability in these pastures? And then the last part of this one is, are there any developments happening in or near these pastures, like roads or transmission lines? And if so, is that being accounted for?
Okay, yeah, I kind of addressed, I think, the first part of that yeah, all of our study sites, it's a criteria that we've used to select study sites. They all have to have Wyoming big sage as at least a portion of the overstory. So the amount of other sagebrush varies among the 5 study sites, but Wyoming big sage is a component of all of them. Let's see, the other question was mesic habitat. Yeah, that definitely varies among our study sites. It's present to a greater or lesser extent at each of our study sites. We know, because we have collared hens, for example, we know that at some of our study sites, the hens move quite a ways away for the brood rearing season, and even further away for the winter, and then come back, whereas some of our other study sites, they seem to stay put for the whole year. We plan to, and we've been working slowly on a very, very detailed spatial GIS map that includes everything from mesic habitat to every fence line, every fence post, every 2-track, so every water tank, so that we can do some really rich spatial analyses. But that's kind of that wasn't really part of our early study plan, so we haven't we haven't done any analyses in that regard, but we are quantifying those resources within each one of our pastures. And then the last question, I think part of that was about infrastructure. So again, that was another one of our criterion from the outset, is that we specifically wanted study sites that had very little power lines, buildings, and infrastructure. So if you recall one of my early slides that had pictures of our study sites, they're pretty unspoiled landscapes with very limited development. There's some ranch houses embedded in some of our allotments, but by and large, it's native sagebrush, native bunch grasses with fences for the pastures, and not very, very little power lines or infrastructure.
Great, thank you. And we are still getting quite a lot of questions coming in here. So if we don't get to your individual question today, we will definitely pass these along to Courtney and Paul and have them follow up as appropriate offline. So just wanted to remind everyone of that here. I think we can squeeze in one more question here before we wrap up. So this one's a little bit long, but I will read through all of it here. So your results found differences with overlapping error bars in sandberg bluegrass height associated with random, failed, and successful nests. Sandberg bluegrass is a sturdy grass in southern Idaho. It's the last one left on the site when the taller native perennial grasses have become rare. And this is a shift from taller grasses to sandberg bluegrasses is often attributed to decades of livestock grazing. So your results could be interpreted as grazing altered the studied rangelands enough that changing grazing now doesn't matter. So how would you respond to this interpretation?
Yeah, great question for a lot of different reasons. So first of all, I'll just say, we fully intend to have some important caveats when we get around, when we get to the point where we're ready to publish any of our results. And it's very true, and we know this thoroughly, that we are not able to look at, and our study design is not designed to look at long-term effects of grazing. And so we are really looking at the effects of a short-term removal of grazing. And to make it palatable, to make it something that we felt like we could ask ranchers to do, we brought them a design that says we want to have one pasture that you don't graze for 4 consecutive years, and that was the most the planning team decided we should ask. And if the study continues to be funded and the results are still not clear, that we could potentially ask them to keep going if they're happy if things are going well. But anyway, even at 4 years, that's really not long enough to examine any kind of changes that already occurred or are occurring, are going to occur due to changes in species composition necessarily. So there's a bunch of different mechanisms by which livestock grazing might affect sage grouse, and some of those mechanisms require more than just 1 or 2 or 4 years to manifest. We just have to be clear that we are which mechanisms we're looking at and what we can and can't say. But you're right. I mean, that's why I presented the differences between Sandberg and Squirrel Tail. I think, Sandberg is very different than some of those bunch grasses in a whole bunch of different ways. And I think one potential outcome that we see is that our results may lead to a much more nuanced habitat, sage grouse habitat management plans that are potentially somewhat species specific for different grasses. For example, the 7-inch double height is really not a species specific guideline or recommendation, but these grasses are just very different from each other, and Sandberg in particular is very different from the bunch grasses that we're working with. I guess I'll just leave it at that unless Paul has something he wants to add to on that topic.
No, I think you pretty well nailed it there, Courtney. I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, this is John Tull from the Great Basin LCC. This is an exciting topic. We're really excited to be a part of helping get this long-term study underway. We recognize that it's got a lot of potential to influence management decision-making across the Great Basin. So thank you, Courtney and Paul, for both of your insights, and Courtney for sharing your preliminary data on this long-term research project. I also want to thank everyone who attended today's webinar. We will have a recording of the presentation available on our website later this week, so if you have colleagues or others interested in this topic but weren't able to make it, they will be able to view it at a later time. If you have any questions about the Landscape Conservation Cooperative or this research, go ahead and contact myself, Courtney, or Paul. Our contact information is on the screen right now. And then last but not least, we really want to know what you thought about the webinar, so please do take the short 2-minute survey that will appear on your screen as you log off. Your feedback really helps us shape and improve our future webinars. So with that, thank you everybody, and have a good day.
Thanks, John. Thanks for everybody who attended.
Thank you.